Well, hey everyone, I am here with William Vanderbloemen, the founder and president of Vanderbloemen Search Group and the author of a brand new book called Next. And it is all about pastoral succession. And so welcome, William. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Justin. Great to be with you.
Well, your book really is fascinating because it talks about something that not a lot of pastors probably want to consider when thinking through their long-term plan. That's succession. Why did you feel like it was important to talk about pastoral succession?
Yeah, well, our company, churches and ministries hire us to help them find their next pastor or key staff person. And it seemed like we got kind of a wave for a while of pastors who planted their church in the early 90s or maybe the late 80s. And they're not tied to any particular denomination. And now they're hovering around 60, 65. And we're getting a call saying, we've never had another pastor. What are we going to do? And we started looking at the numbers and realizing that there's a lot of this out there. So we thought, well, let's try and get our hands around what do you do? Because there are a couple of smaller books, case studies and things. But the more we studied it, the more we realized, this is not just about pastors who are retiring. And it dawned on me one day, I had a thought come across my mind that actually, I think it's how the book starts. And it's this thought: every pastor is an interim pastor.
That's powerful.
Yeah. And I mean, we see literally 1,000 or so different new people come into our system every week. And when we see what people want to do with their life, they'll say, oh, one day I want to be a senior pastor, or I want to be an associate or a children's pastor, student pastor, worship pastor. It is very rare to hear anyone say, what I want to be an interim pastor.
Yeah.
There are a few guys out there that's like their deal. They like doing that, but nobody wants it. But the truth is, I mean, the way I see it, there are really only three ways your ministry ends. Either you run the church into the ground and it closes. So, like that's option one.
Yeah.
Or Jesus could return while you're pastor. That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah.
But just in case he doesn't, the only other option is someone's going to come after you. And for the last 25 years or so, corporate America has really been paying attention to this, where it's kind of the chief function of the board and the CEO is to prepare for the next person. So we wanted to say, what would have happened if we wrote a resource that would help pastors, boards, even a student pastor or some, young pastor to plan and be ready for the time when it comes to transition.
I have a really good friend right now. He's been in his church 29 years, kind of fits right into the prototype that you just talked about. He started the church 29 years ago and has just now started introducing to his board this idea of succession. He's getting, I think he's late 50s, early 60s, and has a lot of great years left, but at the same time doesn't want to leave his church in a bad place if he chooses to retire or to go do something else. Should churches, as an organization, as well as pastors, should both of them be thinking about succession? Should a church itself as a corporate entity, should they have a succession plan independent of what their pastor does, or is it something that they should work together to do?
I think it's something you work together, but I mean, right now the conversation is such a fresh one. Even with a student pastor, I think that I read the other day the average tenure of a student pastor in the U.S. right now is about 18 months.
Yeah.
Like, wow. So could we as a church say, we want to hire you with some kind of extension on your salary or your bonus that incentivizes you to stay at least 3 years, or, don't make it 10, but 3, 4, 5 years where you wouldn't have to start every now and then. Same's true with pastors, but honestly, the senior pastor succession conversation is so new that I've got a friend, Bob Russell, who wrote a case study of his own transition, which is really a good book. It's a little, you can read it real quick, but super good, called Transition Plan. But in it, he says, if the pastor brings up this conversation, it's a succession conversation. If the board brings up the conversation, it's a termination conversation. It's probably it's really on the senior pastor. And In every successful succession that we looked at, and we studied about 500 different transitions and did almost 200 full case studies, every successful one rose and fall on the outgoing pastor being just a prince of a guy that was committed to the church winning. So that's why when we wrote the book, we wrote it for pastors, really young and old, with the idea that the pastor would read it, and right over his shoulder is a board member reading along with him.
Yeah. Well, do you think, having been a pastor for almost 20 years, I think the thought of someone, quote unquote, replacing you, it can get in your head a little bit. It can, create a little bit of insecurity. Do you think that's why some of these conversations aren't happening outwardly? Most of them happen behind closed doors, or maybe even a lot of succession conversations happen after it was too late, like the pastor stayed too long or wasn't willing. And so he was forced that.
We have a whole chapter. Yeah, we have a whole chapter in the book, and we talk about what we call Brett Favre syndrome. Where you
just keeps coming back.
I got one more, man. I got one more. And, great guy, but the same thing that gave him the guts to play so gritty had a shadow side. It was a voice that said, "You got one more year." And I think that happens with pastors too. So, there's just a whole lot of things in the book that will help pastors. But the primary hope for us is that this book just legitimizes the conversation. Because pastors have been kind of backed into a corner. A pastorate is a job, but it's not a job. We call it a calling. And we talk about how it's more than just a job. It's your life. And I'm afraid that somewhere along the way, and I've been guilty of this when I was a pastor, we get confused. The church is married, yes, but not to the pastor. The church is married to the Savior. And when churches get confused and think they're married to the pastor, and the pastor talks about succession, it's like, what? You're leaving me? You want to date around? It's all these mixed metaphors, and hopefully, kind of refocusing the conversation on the church and the church being the bride of Christ will free up, us to think again about transitions. It used to be in the United Methodist Church, every 4 years it was moving day. Pastor moved out in the morning, new one moved in the evening, and life went on just fine. But somewhere along the way, I think we've gotten a little confused. And hopefully this will help sort of dislodge that confusion and start a new conversation.
Other than Southeast, because Southeast Christian, as you mentioned with Bob Russell and Dave Stone, they're kind of the models. They started this succession conversation long before anybody else really, and they have a proven plan. But talk about a couple of other examples from your book of churches that have done it really well.
Well, Bob and Dave have done a great job, and Dave's a great guy, but the thing really rose and fell on Bob's shoulders. And the one thing I would tell folks is kind of like, Hybels and Warren used to have these conferences, and people would come and they'd say, do not just try to do what we're doing. It doesn't work. It's not a cookie cutter. And after studying 500 transitions, I'd say there is no cookie cutter. There are some baseline principles. We try and outline those, a chapter in the book, the 10 commandments of succession planning, that sort of thing. But what is a successful transition runs the gamut. We talked to the Stockstill family in Baton Rouge at a really large church, Bethany World Prayer Center. The founder passed it on to his son, who at 58 passed it on to his son. So now the grandson is the pastor, and he's killing it. He's doing an awesome.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's a little bit of a generalization, but we saw that sort of pattern a lot in the spirit-filled part of the kingdom. I don't know why that is, but it just seems to be more culturally accepted by the church. Where if you tried to do that at First Presbyterian Church of fill in the blank, that's just not ever going to happen. So
right.
I think the main thing is when there's a cultural expectation that the succession is going to happen, it doesn't surprise the congregation. That's the biggest key, and it could be well planned and go poorly. We talked to everybody who did not work out at First Baptist Dallas after Dr. Criswell, and that took a while. We talked to the biggest father-son transition that I know publicly, other than John and Joel Osteen, who we talked to them as well, is Robert and Bob Schuler, which completely fell apart, and the church is in bankruptcy now. So, there's just not a singular right way. I would not just copy what your big brother did or what the church down the road did. You really need to get a conversation going that's among your leadership, and I think with some outside help, a trusted friend of the church, a consultant, a denominational person, if there is one that's functional in your situation.
Well, you probably, I mean, especially if you're talking about a lead pastor or a founding pastor, you probably know the stat better than I do, but the statistics of pastors who succeed after a founding pastor are very low. And so usually, unless that founding pastor is very, very intentional and very, very humble, it isn't going to work very well. What were a few, you mentioned, that there's no cookie cutter right way to do it. What were a few pitfalls? Did you find anything in common with churches that it didn't work out? A couple of things that they may have done wrong?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing for sure is churches that didn't get it right had sometimes the pastor's fault, sometimes the board, sometimes both, but the pastor couldn't afford to retire, literally, financially. That's a big deal. And sometimes that's the church expects the pastor to live on slave's wage, and so they do, and they kind of live hand to mouth. Sometimes it's the pastor, trying to live a lifestyle they can't afford. But for whatever reason, we saw a lot of failed successions when there was not money to be had. The other big tender spot for outgoing pastors is, what do I do with myself when I'm not the pastor? There's not another job that I know that consumes so much of your identity. I mean, it's where you do your friendships. It's where you do your work. It's where you're in the most emotional and holy times of people's lives. And it's where you're doing your own spiritual pilgrimage. And so you pour your whole life into that, and then it's over and you walk away and the phone doesn't ring very much. And if a pastor either doesn't have resources and doesn't have something to pour their identity into, then there could be a real problem. I mean, it used to be you pastored till you were 55 or 60, and then you went and you taught at a seminary, or you started a mission cause. Or so I think getting a sense early on in ministry of what do you want to do later. I've been lucky to have John Maxwell speak into my life for quite a number of years. And one thing John told me one time when I was younger, I said, John, what do I do as a pastor in my 30s, now that I'm at a fairly good sized church? He said, William, smart young men spend their early years creating options for their later years. And, that could be financial, but it could also be developing areas of passion and ministry that you can do that allow you to transition. John, the Stockstill family at Bethany, Brother Larry, he is the outgoing pastor who handed it off to Jonathan. Jonathan runs the church. He gave the whole mission portfolio to his dad. His dad preaches all over the world and plants churches, and neither one of them get in each other's way. It's fantastic. Yeah. It gives identity, a place to put time and energy, and not feel like you've just been put out to pasture.
Right. That's good. It's a sense of purpose that person still is able to live with, at the same time handing off the reins and not necessarily being involved in the day-to-day details, which I know is probably pretty tough as an outgoing pastor.
Yeah, and I'd say the one other one, the kind of the secret that's not, we didn't make a big deal out of in the book because we didn't want to embarrass people, is a lot of failed successions. You can draw a straight line back to the outgoing pastor's spouse. It's really, really sad. And I think it's because churches maybe don't pay attention enough to what's going on. I mean, that's a serious grieving for a spouse. That their whole social network, everything they poured into is gone. Yeah. And, smart churches will do whatever they can to take care of the pastor's spouse, especially in the latter years of their career, to try and make a really nice transition for them.
We've had a couple of conversations with friends of ours who are close to retirement age, and their spouses, a couple of them live with a sense of bitterness because they don't feel like their husband was appreciated for all the years that he poured into a church. And here it's a sad reality when you have a person who's given 25 or 30 years of their life to a group of people, and the spouse doesn't feel like they're appreciated or they're loved after all of that sacrifice. And so bringing that spouse along in the process of succession is probably just as important as bringing the board along. I'm assuming.
I think that's right. I think that's right. Yeah.
What do you hope pastors and churches will begin to do after they read next? What's your hope for the book, as far as, like, a year from now, 3 years from now? What do you hope happens in the church book?
Well, I'd like to think that we'll get to a place one day where your earliest board meetings as a pastor talk about, okay, what are we going to do when I'm not here anymore? So that from the beginning of your time as a pastor, you're talking about the transition. And it just sort of, pops the balloon and lets all the pressure out. And there's a conversation that happens on an annual basis. I'd like to see boards providing financial planning for their pastors, or paying for them to go see a CFP or somebody to help them get their finances in order. I'd love to see churches building pipelines for new leaders. I mean, you look at what Hillsong Church is doing all over the world now. It's not an overnight success. They are the 30-year overnight success because they've been building a pipeline for 30 years. So, if all that happens, then I'm out of a job because search firms are irrelevant. But I'd love to think that could happen. It'd be a fun thing to see happen for the kingdom.
Well, it's almost biblical. Like, you see people personally developing, in the New Testament, the next leaders, and handing different ministries off to them. So I think that's awesome. Well, that's great, man. I'm really excited about this resource. I think for so long, you have churches that have been threatened by their senior pastor leaving, or you have pastors who have been threatened by the church wanting to move on to, a new leader or a younger leader. And so this conversation brings all of that out into the open and allows us just to deal in truth and have honest conversations about, the fact that most senior pastors will not die in the pulpit. They will either retire, as you said, Jesus is going to come back, or the church is going to close. And so I think it's a great conversation to have.
Well, I appreciate you hosting us. Thanks so much for making time. We really love you guys and what you're doing for the kingdom.
Well, thanks so much, William. We appreciate all that you're doing to serve the Big C Church worldwide. Really appreciate you.